Alright, so hey everyone. Today I want to take a look at the Deadzones for No Man's Sky. This is being demonstrated on the Xbox Series X in case it differs on other platforms. But to start with movement, what we have here is about a 21% bloated square Deadzone. And because of the shape, it's larger in the corners. You can see that there are two rings within the Deadzone, and if you're between the solid ring and the dashed ring, when you move the camera, the character will move. So you'll see he's just sliding across the ground with no animation, or that's coming up. But if you're between the dotted threshold and the bloated square Deadzone, the same behavior will occur but with an animation. I was just bleeding into that range before. You have to break out of the bloated square Deadzone before movement can occur without the camera Deadzone, or without the camera movement at all. But for your angles, this game has full diagonal movement, forwards movement, and if we try to use a reference, let's take this plant out in the distance. If I move to the right of this axis, I can drift away from it a little bit, and if I move to the left, I can drift into it a little bit. And you might be able to see it more clearly with the character animations. If I just rotate around the Deadzone, there are no gaps in diagonal movement. It's just a smooth transition. I did attempt to test the movement speeds, or the movement curve. However, either the character's acceleration or uneven ground made those tests pretty unreliable, but it does seem like there's some gradient here. If I move right past the Deadzone and slowly move forward, the character's speed increases, but they seem to hit full speed pretty early, and a large portion of the stick is just your full run speed. The shaded region represents your sprint threshold, and if you try to sprint beneath it, nothing will happen. But if you're above about 78%, you will be allowed to start a sprint, and your sprint will stop if you fall under this threshold. Additionally, of course, if you're above this threshold and the trigger, or press the stick in again, you'll return to your normal running speed. For the camera, we have the same about 21% bloated square Deadzone. And the same full diagonal movement. And this is much more easy to see right around the horizontal axis when capped in the view like this. The curve is a very subtle exponential curve, and it's very difficult to see because of this, but it appears to be cropped, so it's likely scaled to a smaller Deadzone size, and I'm not sure exactly what that could be, but this increases very slowly until the very end of stick movement, where it ramps up dramatically. This type of Deadzone is created by having an underlying radial dead zone, probably something like what we see with the movement, and having a square dead zone applied on top of it. The square dead zone is bloated by the underlying radial dead zone. The radial dead zone warps the square shape outward. But in most of these cases, this square dead zone does normally crop off lower inputs, so that's probably what's doing that. This curve might be connected to the 12 or 15% or some other size radial dead zone within here, but the square dead zone is cropping off the initial part of that. Something that's not visible in practice just because of how slow the curve starts, but it is eating some amount of the smallest possible speeds. But this curve is applied radially, meaning distance from the center, and that's good. You're supposed to do that rather than from the distance off each axis. And you can see that if I make circles with my stick, it can move further in the diagonal regions. So this would be beyond 100% magnitude from the center, and this game ignores this. This input is the same as this. It just ignores it. And this is also something that's good, because this makes it so that any direction you point the stick is going to have a consistent acceleration percent. Your diagonals are not faster, at least percentage-wise, compared to your cardinal directions. But for the horizontal and vertical sensitivities, the vertical sensitivity appears to be about 50% of the horizontal. I couldn't get an accurate estimate, but you can see if I make quick movements like this horizontally, that the vertical is pretty clearly slower. And there could be some smoothing applied. It's difficult to tell. It might be a speed threshold thing, but it does seem like very quick movements aren't fully expressed. You see that once it's fully going, this is a pretty decent sensitivity, but for small movements, it's not terribly noticeable. But since the vertical sensitivity is slower, this, in most cases, makes your diagonal movement incorrect and biased towards the more horizontal axis. So I'm moving at about 45 degrees, but the cursor is moving a little flatter than that because of the different axis sensitivities. This is very common in most games with differing axis sensitivities. But the final dead zone is the mini cursor, and this is identical to the camera. So we have this 21% bloated square dead zone with full diagonal movement, and this is very easy to see, capping it to the screen edges like this, so right around the horizontal axis and right around the vertical axis. The curve for this, however, is linear, and we can sort of see this cropping much more easily, where it starts much faster than it should, but does continue linearly from that point on. So that basically covers the dead zones for this game. So certainly they're functional, and for movement, I think that's mostly fine. There is that strange thresholds within the dead zone, but for the most part, players are going to be moving their stick beyond this range, so that won't really ever be noticeable. And you have full diagonal movement, which is probably the most important for the movement dead zone. But the camera could definitely use some work. And in general, changing the dead zones to radial and scaling the input around it would address some of these problems. For the camera, again, the curve starts so slow you might not notice it, but that's curve options are something that I think would improve the game on a whole. But first, requesting dead zone options, so we'll switch to radial dead zones and having options to control the size for both the movement and the camera dead zones. For the camera, lower dead zones can help add some additional precision. The curve starts very slow, so it is easy to make small adjustments, but having the dead zone can make the controls feel more responsive just from that. But curve options, some players may find this curve too slow for the majority of the movement and might find this jump a little jarring. So having other options available could fit those preferences. I think that controlling the degree of a power function is the easiest and a very powerful way of offering players that level of customization. Players that want linear curves can have that. Players that want more exponential curves can have that with a very smooth gradient in between. But if that curve option was offered, it would be very important to scale it, because since this curve moves, the default curve starts so slowly, you don't really notice the cropping with the camera since it starts so slow. But with the cursor, the curve is much more noticeable, and players who want to use more linear curves would definitely feel that issue if it was unscaled. For the vertical sensitivity, there's only one sensitivity option available, and so the vertical is just stuck where it's at. Having a separate vertical sensitivity slider would allow players to set them the same if they wanted them to be the same, and that would also, if they were set the same, would also make the angles correct, because right now with a lower vertical sensitivity, all your angles are skewed horizontally. But I think that about covers things. So yeah. So thanks for watching, and everyone, have a great rest of your day.